Hello and welcome to the first video in the Kilpin Knitting Club series. Today I'm going to show you how to knit and to purl onto your knit kit that I dropped off earlier. So your knit kit will look something like this, probably a different colour. You'll have two needles. You'll have one needle that's got all your knitting on it, and then you'll have a needle that doesn't have anything on it. The knitting that you're working on currently is called your work, and I'll keep calling it that through the videos. Now, knit and purl are two different stitches. They're very similar, but they are the foundation of almost all knitting patterns that you will ever find. So you'll find them in lots of different combinations. Together they can make lots of interesting patterns. And once you've mastered them, pretty much you've mastered all of knitting. Everything else that you'll learn is just an adaptation of knitting and purling. So what we're looking at here is, this is knit stitch. So knitting is quite obvious when you look at it because it's all made of these sort of V shapes. And then the other side looks like this, and this is purl. And purl you can tell by all these little horizontal bars that go across. So typically in a very basic piece of knitting like this, you'll have one side which is knitting like this, and one side which is purl like this. When we work on a piece of knitting or a piece of work, we refer to a right side and a wrong side of the fabric. So this is the right side and this is the wrong side. Simply put, it's just if you were making a garment like a jumper or a hat, the right side is the bit that faces outwards. And typically the right side is made up of knitting because it's the slightly neater looking stitch. But if you have a more interesting pattern, you might have combinations of knitting and purling on the right side. So I will talk about the right side and the wrong side of the work throughout. So the general principle of knitting and purling is you'll start with all of your stitches on your left hand needle, and you will transfer them one by one, creating new stitches as you go onto your right hand needle until all of your stitches are on the right hand side. We will be working from right to left, so we're going to start here and then we're going to work along our work this way until we get to the end, and then all of our stitches will be on the right hand needle. So let's get started. So this piece of yarn here that's connected to your ball of wool is called your working yarn, and that's what I'll keep calling it. When we're doing knitting, which is what we're going to start doing now, you want the working yarn to be just behind your work or just coming off the back of your needle like this. Sorry, the focus is going in and out a little bit. I'll try not to keep pulling it so close to the camera. So your working yarn is kept to the back like this. So to do a knit, we're going to take your right hand needle, and what you want to do is we're going to start with this first stitch on your left hand needle, and we're going to insert your right hand needle from bottom to top through this stitch, and we're going to cross our needles over as we do that. So I'll show you again. So we're going to do it into this first stitch here. You're going to take your right hand needle and you're going to slip it from bottom to top into that loop on that left hand needle until your needles are crossing over and you're coming out of the other side of the stitch. You can pull on it a little bit because it's attached to the working yarn and it'll loosen a little bit. So you can see what I've done there. I've gone from bottom to top through this loop and I've crossed over my needles this way. So my right hand needle has gone behind my left hand needle and I've got this loop sort of looped around both of the needles, and if I pull on the working yarn it'll tighten a little bit. So then what we're going to do is you're going to take your working yarn and you're going to loop it through in between where these two needles are crossed over, so it pulls down in between and it's going to come down over that stitch that we've just put our right hand needle into. I'll just show you that again. It's gone in front of the right hand needle, which now appears to be on the left, and we're going to put it behind the left hand needle so until it comes down in between the two needles and on top of the stitch. Now if you take your right hand needle, which is this one, if you slip it backwards very gently, so you can see I'm slipping it backwards here, keep it all the time in contact with the left hand needle, so keep your needles pressed together and gently pull it backwards. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to pull it out of the stitch, but we're going to keep the working yarn looped around it here. I'm going to show you that again. I'm going to show you what I've just done. I'll put it back to where it was. So you're going to take your right hand needle, you're going to slip it from bottom to top through this stitch on the left hand needle, so the needles are crossed over and your right hand needle is behind and your left hand needle is in the front. You're going to take your working yarn, pull it slightly tight, and pass it in front of the right hand needle, which is this one. You're going to pass it behind the left hand needle, so it passes in between where the two needles are crossed over, and so it's pressed on top of the stitch that we've just put our needles into. Then, very gently and very slowly, pull your right hand needle backwards, but keeping it in contact with the left hand needle at all times. Very gently, and then try to pull your working yarn through at the same time, like this. And now what you see is you've got two loops. You've got this loop here, and you've got this loop here that are keeping your two needles stuck together. Then the next step is to shuffle your work upwards slightly. And what we're going to do is we're going to pull the left hand needle, this one, we're going to pull that gently out of that loop because we've completed that stitch, and that stitch is now on the right hand needle here. So I'm going to show you all that again with the next stitch. So we're going to insert our right hand needle, this one, from bottom to top into the next stitch. So our needles are crossing over like this. Take your working yarn, put it to the back, and take it round here, so it's going in front of the right hand needle, which is on the left now, and take it behind the left hand needle until it comes down in between and it sits on top of this stitch here. Then gently pull your right hand needle backwards so it's backing out of this loop, very gently, keeping it in contact all the time with the left hand needle, and then pull the working yarn through like this, so you've got a loop here. And then shuffle your work up the needle like this, sort of shuffle, 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 and then pull that loop off the top, and now we've got another stitch on there. So you just keep doing that. So I'm going to keep going a little bit faster. You can keep rewinding this if you want to. You can pause it so you can see what I've done. You keep going down the row like this. Ooh. I'm trying to do this with a camera placed in between my face and the knitting. And I'm not used to doing it that way, so I'm a little bit slower than I would normally be. I'll be with you in a second when I've completed this row. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep doing a knit into each of these stitches until I get to the end, which is there. Hello again. So here we are. I'm just a few stitches away from finishing off this row, so I'm just going to keep going. Talk amongst yourselves. There, and we keep going until we get, sorry, that noise is my knitting needles hitting my tripod. Oops! Now, this is a good example of what to do if you slip your stitch. So what I've just done there is I've not managed to slip the working yarn in between. I've prematurely pulled that loop. This one was originally on the left hand needle here. What I've done is I've prematurely pulled that through. So what I'm going to do, don't worry if that happens, you do need to put it back on this needle to redo that stitch because you haven't actually done a stitch there, you've just passed it across. So you can just do that. You can just slip your left hand needle back into it and then pull the right hand needle out because you're not ready to stitch it yet. So I'm going to try and do that again. Ooh. Ooh. Oh, see, I've done it again, I've missed it. There we are, last one. So there we are. So now I've got a newly completed row of knitted stitches on there. Now, of course, these are in my right hand now. My right hand needle's got all the stitches on it, and my left hand needle is empty. So first, before I do anything else, I have to swap hands. So I'm going to take my empty needle and put it back in my right hand, and then my work is back on the needle on the left. So now you can see, now I've switched it this way, we're now looking at the wrong side of the fabric with all the purl stitches on. And you can tell that they're purl stitches because they're made up of these little horizontal bars like this. So now I'm going to show you how to purl. Now, we've just done a row of knitted stitches along there, but actually on the back of a knitted stitch, I've actually done purls. So I've already shown you how to do a purl stitch, but backwards, because when you do knitting like this, the back is actually purl. So when we're going back along the wrong side of the fabric, as we're going to do now, we have to do purl, but on the right side it will appear as a row of knitting. So this is how you end up with one sort of consistent stitch on one side of the fabric like this. Despite the fact we've gone along doing knitting and we're about to go along doing purl, it all appears like it's the same stitch on the right side of the fabric. So now I'm going to show you how to do purl. So for purl, we're essentially doing what we did with the knitting, but sort of backwards. So what you want to do is make sure that your working yarn is in the front this time. So if you remember when we were knitting, we wanted the working yarn to be at the back, but now we want it to be at the front because we're going to do purl. Okay. So it's a similar principle. We're going to work one by one, and we're going to transfer all the stitches from our left-hand needle onto our right-hand needle, but we're going to do purl rather than knitting. So to do purl, remember, working yarn is at the front this time, not the back. So what you want to do is make sure that you haven't got your working yarn looped around the back. So let me just show you that, what it would look like if it was around the back. What you don't want is you don't want it here. You don't want it around the back. You want it here at the front. So to purl, let me just get it back in focus. To purl, we're going to do something similar, but we're going to put the needle, the right-hand needle goes into the stitch from top to bottom this time. So when we were knitting, it was going from bottom to top, but for purl, we're going from top to bottom. We've still got our needles crossed over like this, but the right-hand needle is in the front. Now it looks like it's on the left here, and the left-hand needle that's got all your work on it is underneath. Okay, and then you pick up your working yarn, which is still here at the front. You might find it helpful to lightly put your thumb on this stitch just to keep it in place while you do this. What you're going to do is you're going to loop your working yarn over the right hand needle like this. So you're going to take it, it's in the front, remember it's at the front, and we're going to loop it over the top of the right hand needle like this until it comes out the back, like this. And then, similarly as we did when we were knitting, pull your right hand needle backwards slightly. We're going to back it out of that stitch, but keeping it in contact always with the left hand needle, and slip your working yarn through with it. So you've got a loop there. So it's just like when we did knitting, except we're doing it kind of upside down. And then shuffle your work upwards like this and slip that stitch off because we've done it. We've done a purl there. You can see the horizontal bar going across because we've done a purl. So I'm going to show you that again. As with knitting, always once you've done a stitch, pull slightly on your working yarn to create a nice, not a tight loop on here. We don't want it to be super tight, but we want it to be nice and tidy. So give your working yarn a little bit of a pull to keep it nice and tight. So I'm going to show you that again. So you've got your right hand needle here, and we're going to put it from top to bottom through the next stitch on the left hand needle. Put your thumb lightly on this loop here just to keep it in place. I find that helps. And then take your working yarn over the top of the right hand needle and round the back like this. Back up your right hand needle very gently, keeping it in contact with the left needle at all times. Pop it out and then take your working yarn up with it like that. And then slip your work upwards and pop the stitch off the left hand needle. So we're going to go along and just keep doing that like this. And I will continue along and I will meet you back at the other side. And here we are. So I've gone along and I've purled all along here. So now most of my stitches are on my right hand needle and I've just got a few left on my left hand. So I'm just going to keep going. So remember, for purl, your working yarn needs to be at the front here. Slip your needle from top to bottom through the next stitch. So your right hand needle's on the front and your left hand needle's at the back. Put your thumb on here just to keep the stitch in place, and then wrap your working yarn around to the back and underneath of your right hand needle. Slip it backwards gently and pop your working yarn through with a loop like this. Shimmy your work up here and pop it off the needle. Like this. To the last one, here we are. And then we've got a nice row of purled stitches on here, and you can see that because I've got all these horizontal bars on here. I apologise in advance for the quality of this video. I'm trying to knit for the very first time with a camera and a tripod in between my legs while I knit. And I'm looking at the screen on the back of my camera rather than looking at my knitting, which is not the way I'm accustomed to doing it, so it's a little bit wobbly. But we're getting there together. So there we are. So I've just turned my work over and I've swapped hands again. So I've got my empty needle in my right hand and I've got my needle with my work on it on my left. And you can see we've got a lovely row of knit. This is the purl we've just done, but it looks like knit on this side. So you can see how we're quite quickly building up a really nice tidy square, or a rectangle if you keep going, of really neat knit stitches on the right side and purl stitches on the wrong side. And once you've mastered knitting and purling, you can do almost any knitting pattern. In later lessons, what I'm going to show you is how to do things like increase or decrease your stitches. So if you didn't want to just keep going in a straight line like this, and let's say you wanted to increase this, so if you wanted to add extra stitches as you went up, what you'd end up with is your work would start being this sort of width at the bottom, but it would get wider and wider as you went up. You might want to do something like that if you were doing a sleeve of a jumper, for example. So I can show you how to increase and decrease stitches to do that nice and neatly. You can also do things like buttonholes, so you can skip a few stitches and then cover them back up when you come back the other way, doing a different row, and that creates a nice neat little hole. I'm not very good at them, but I'll try and get better at it by the time I do that lesson. I will also at some point teach you how to knit in the round, so you can actually go in a circle while you're knitting rather than a straight line, which is what I've just done. This enables you to do things in like a tube shape rather than one big square of knitting. I tend to do that a lot of the time when I'm doing things like jumpers and sleeves. They work much better, in my opinion, if they're in just a big circle rather than two separate pieces of knitting that you stitch together at the end. We'll cover that at a later time. So please practice and practice with your knit kit that I've given you. Practice knitting and purling as much as you want to. Don't panic if you drop stitches. I don't care about how neat it looks at the minute. By drop stitches, I mean if you just pull your needle out of a stitch when you didn't intend to and you manage to lose that stitch into the work somewhere. Please don't worry about it. We're not looking for it to be neat at this point. The more you practice, the better you will get at keeping hold of all your stitches in the right place. A good tip when you're practicing knitting is to keep track of how many stitches you've got, because unless you're doing increases and decreases, you should always have the same number of stitches. As you go back and forth, you should always have the same number. If you don't, you'll end up with your knitting inadvertently getting bigger or smaller. So you can just keep track in your head if you want to, if it's a relatively small number. You can do a tally on a piece of paper just to keep track, although I find sometimes that can be a bit challenging because you've got to manage writing on a piece of paper as well as knitting. You don't have that many hands. I've also got an app on my iPhone which is essentially like one of those handheld clickers that you can use to count how many people are going into a building or a nightclub, for example. I've got an app version of that, so I just click on the screen and it just tallies up one more. So that's a good way of keeping track of how many stitches you've got. Your knit kit has 20 stitches across the row, like this, if I've counted them correctly. So you should always have 20 stitches. Regardless of how many rows you've done, you should always have 20. If you find you're losing them and you find your work is getting smaller as you go, it's because you're dropping them. Don't worry about that. But if you do find that's happening, we can have a chat about it. You know, send me some photos or videos of what your knitting looks like and we'll see if we can get to the bottom of it. I would love to see how you're all getting on. If you get stuck at any point, if you're not sure, if you want me to go over something in a bit more detail, if you have just done a bit of knitting and you're like, I don't think this looks right, please help. You can send me photos and videos on WhatsApp. Please leave comments in the YouTube video and I will do my very best to help you. I am working full-time from home at the moment, but because I'm at home, I can help quite a lot of the time. And I do love knitting, so I can spend hours doing it, so I really don't mind helping out. I hope this is giving you something to do while we're all on lockdown, and I hope this is a skill that you will continue to learn because it's really rewarding being able to make your own things. I love making my own jumpers and hats and scarves and things, so I really hope you get lots of pleasure out of it. So this has been the first lesson for the Kilpin Knitting Club, and I have shown you how to knit and purl, which, if you ask me, are the only things you really need to know to be able to learn to knit. Stay safe, and I will talk to you soon.